She walked into the White House carrying the weight of 450 million people and walked out unable to speak. Not because the meeting had been difficult, not because the negotiations had broken down in the way that difficult negotiations sometimes break down, with sharp words and slammed doors and the familiar wreckage of diplomatic failure that experienced leaders have seen before and know how to process. She walked out unable to speak because what had happened inside that room was not a negotiation. It was not a meeting. It was a termination. Donald Trump placed a document on the resolute desk and slid it across to Ursula von der Leyen with the calm, unhurried precision of someone who had been building toward this moment for months and had designed every detail of it to land with maximum and irreversible force. The document had 4 words on its cover: Final Invoice, United States of America. The number on the first page was $2.3 trillion. And when von der Leyen looked up from that number and said the 3 words that have now detonated the most severe transatlantic crisis since the Cold War, Trump did not shout. He did not raise his voice. He smiled, the smile of a man whose plan had just been triggered exactly as designed. And the chain of events that smile set in motion is already spreading across Europe in ways that nobody in Brussels has a framework to stop. The official schedule released to the press described a routine diplomatic engagement, bilateral discussions, trade dialogue, a reaffirmation of transatlantic partnership. That was what European citizens watching the news were told. That was what the journalists assembled outside the White House gates were told. That was the public architecture constructed around a meeting whose actual character and actual purpose were something entirely different from the description that had been provided to manage expectations and prevent the kind of pre-meeting speculation that would have complicated the dynamics of what was being planned inside. Von der Leyen arrived with 4 senior advisors. Her preparation had been extensive and serious. Her team had run simulations of the likely conversation, prepared detailed responses to the scenarios they considered most probable, drafted compromise proposals that addressed the American grievances most likely to dominate the discussion, and rehearsed the sequencing of their presentation with the thoroughness that a meeting of this significance demanded. They had war-gamed the conversation across multiple sessions in the days before the Washington trip. They believed they had anticipated the difficult terrain and prepared adequately for it. They had not prepared for what was waiting, because what was waiting could not have been anticipated from outside the room where it had been planned. The departure from normal protocol began the moment von der Leyen's team entered the West Wing. She was not taken to the traditional meeting space where foreign dignitaries of her stature are received. She was escorted through a corridor that ran away from the cameras, away from the press pool positioned in the usual locations, away from the staff members and officials whose presence during visits of this significance would normally be considered standard. The corridor was empty in a way that one of her advisors later described to a European official as feeling deliberately wrong, the kind of emptiness that communicates intention rather than accident. When the door to the Oval Office opened, Trump was already standing, not in the posture of a host preparing to welcome a guest, standing in the center of the room with his arms crossed and the specific set to his jaw that people who have observed him closely across years of high-stakes encounters describe as his closing expression. The expression of a man for whom the decision has already been made and the conversation about to occur is not the process by which the decision will be reached. It is the process by which the decision will be communicated. Von der Leyen extended her hand. Trump did not take it. He held her gaze for a long moment without speaking, and then turned and walked back to the desk. Her hand remained extended for 2 full seconds before she lowered it. Those 2 seconds were witnessed by every person in that room, and every person who witnessed them understood immediately and completely what was being established. This was not a meeting between partners who disagreed. This was a demonstration of the distance between a position of total leverage and a position of none, conducted in the universal language of deliberate physical discourtesy that requires no translation and admits no ambiguity. Trump sat. He did not invite her to sit. Von der Leyen stood in front of the most consequential desk in the world and waited. Her advisors stood behind her. The silence extended for 11 seconds. One of her team members, who later described the experience to a European colleague, said that those 11 seconds had the specific quality of standing at the edge of something vast and dark without being able to see how far down it went. Then Trump spoke. His opening words were not a greeting. They were not any of the diplomatic register phrases that leaders use to establish the formal courtesy that even difficult meetings begin with as a signal of mutual recognition. He looked at von der Leyen and said 4 words that have since been confirmed by 3 separate sources with direct knowledge of the exchange. You know why you're here. Nothing else. No context offered. No elaboration provided. 4 words that closed the space between a routine diplomatic meeting and something that had no established name in the vocabulary of transatlantic relations because nothing quite like it had happened before. Von der Leyen began her prepared opening. She had one sentence out before Trump raised his hand. The gesture was not aggressive. It was not accompanied by any visible emotion. It was the calm, practiced signal of someone who had used it before and knew precisely what effect it produced. She stopped. Trump reached to the side of his desk and picked up a document bound in a plain blue cover. He placed it in front of him and slid it across the desk toward her. 4 words on the cover in large black type. Final invoice. United States of America. She picked it up. The hands that held it were visibly unsteady according to every person present in that room. She opened to the first page. The number she encountered there was not structured as an opening position in a negotiation designed to be reduced through the normal back and forth of diplomatic bargaining. It was structured as a final demand from a government that had decided the period of patient waiting was finished. $2.3 trillion. Below the number, a breakdown of extraordinary specificity, 73 years of military protection calculated at annual cost and compounded, decades of trade imbalances documented by fiscal year and trading category, the cost of stationing American forces on European soil across every deployment and every installation, the price of every security guarantee extended, every nuclear deterrent maintained, every naval presence that had kept the shipping lanes open through which European commerce moved. Every dollar assigned to a specific category, every year accounted for in the ledger of a relationship that America had apparently decided to finally put on paper and present for settlement. Von der Leyen read the first page. She read the second. She looked up at Trump across the desk and said the 3 words that have now been described in private briefings by European leaders using the word existential without any trace of rhetorical excess. She said, "I will not pay." The room stopped. Trump did not react as anyone present had expected him to react. No raised voice, no visible flash of the anger that his critics had always predicted would define his most dangerous moments. No dramatic gesture that gave the European delegation something to respond to or navigate around. Instead, something considerably more unsettling. He smiled. The specific quality of that smile has been described consistently by the people who witnessed it across their separate accounts of the meeting. It was not warm, it contained no humor, it was the smile of a man watching the last component of a mechanism he had constructed with great care click into exactly the position he had designed it to occupy. He stood from behind the desk without hurrying. He walked around it and stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she had to adjust her eye line upward slightly to maintain contact with his, and he began to speak in a voice controlled to the lower register of someone who has learned that quiet authority lands harder than volume. The people at the back of the room strained to hear. Von der Leyen heard every word with the absolute clarity of someone receiving information that is rearranging their understanding of their situation in real time. Trump told her that her refusal had been anticipated, that it had been planned for, that the United States government had spent the preceding months constructing a response to European defiance that was so comprehensively layered and so precisely calibrated to the specific vulnerabilities of each major European economy that by the time the full scope of it became visible to European governments and European markets, it would already be operating beyond any point at which a coordinated European response could alter its trajectory. Her 3 words had not weakened his position. They had activated it. Then he described what was coming. And the details of what Trump laid out in that room have since moved through multiple channels to reach European governments, financial institutions, and intelligence services across the continent. Every recipient has reacted with the same essential combination of disbelief at the scope and the precision of what was being described, and something closer to terror at the recognition that the timeline attached to it left almost no space for the kind of deliberate institutional response that European crisis management had always depended upon. The first wave Trump described was trade, not the incremental tariff adjustments and targeted sector measures that had characterized the previous rounds of transatlantic commercial friction. Something categorically different in its scale and its simultaneity. 60% tariffs on all European automobiles effective within 30 days, 55% on pharmaceutical exports, 50% on luxury goods, 45% on agricultural products, The numbers had not been chosen through the normal process of trade policy construction in which economists model impacts, industry groups provide input, and the resulting measures reflect a balance between political objectives and economic sustainability. They had been chosen because they mapped precisely onto the specific industries that each major European economy depended upon most completely for the export revenues that funded its broader economic functioning. Germany's automotive sector employed hundreds of thousands of workers whose livelihoods were directly connected to American market access in volumes that a 60% tariff would render commercially non-viable within weeks. France's luxury goods and agricultural export infrastructure represented billions in annual revenue, whose disappearance would land on French producers and French communities with an immediacy that no government subsidy program could meaningfully offset on the timeline involved. Italy's manufacturing base, the Netherlands' pharmaceutical and chemical industries, Spain's agricultural export economy. Every major European economy had a structural vulnerability, and Trump's team had identified each one with the precision of people who had spent months mapping the specific pressure points that would produce maximum damage at minimum time. The comprehensiveness of the targeting was itself a message. This was not improvisation. This was not the product of anger or the expression of a general ideological preference for protectionism. This was a document of specific knowledge about European economic architecture that could only have been assembled through sustained and deliberate preparation. Someone had done the work. Someone had built the map. And the map had been used to construct a set of measures designed not to pressure Europe back to the negotiating table, but to remove Europe's capacity to sustain its current position long enough for negotiation to produce a different outcome. But Trump told von der Leyen that the trade measures were only the first wave. Simultaneous with the tariff announcements, the United States Treasury would initiate coordinated action with allied financial institutions to restrict European access to dollar-denominated financing. The significance of this element of what Trump described cannot be overstated for anyone who understands how European financial architecture actually functions in practice. The dollar is not simply the American currency, it is the operating currency of global finance. European banks maintain dollar liquidity positions because international trade, international debt markets, and international financial transactions across virtually every major category are conducted in dollars. European governments refinance sovereign debt in international markets that price and settle in dollars. The cost of borrowing, the availability of credit, the functioning of the financial plumbing that keeps European economies operating on a daily basis all depend on access to dollar liquidity that American financial institutions and their global counterparts provide. Constraining that access would not produce its effects gradually or gently. It would produce them immediately and across every dimension of European financial functioning simultaneously. Bond yields on Southern European sovereign debt would spike within hours as investors priced in the withdrawal of the confidence that dollar access underpins. Credit ratings would come under pressure. The cost of the routine financial operations that European governments conduct every day would escalate with a speed that budget frameworks built around assumptions of stable financing costs could not accommodate without producing visible fiscal stress of the kind that markets interpret as the early signal of deeper instability. The financial architecture of European prosperity had been built on the assumption that dollar access was a permanent feature of the global financial environment rather than a conditional one subject to withdrawal by political decision in Washington. That assumption was about to be tested in real time across every major European financial market simultaneously. Von der Leyen stood and absorbed the first two waves without speaking. The people watching her described the quality of her stillness in those moments not as the composure of a leader maintaining professional discipline under pressure, but as something different and more fundamental. The stillness of someone whose cognitive and emotional systems have been overwhelmed by the gap between what they had prepared for and what they were receiving. She had wargamed this meeting extensively. No simulation had produced anything resembling what was unfolding in front of her. Then Trump described the third wave, complete and total withdrawal of all American military presence from European soil within 90 days. Not a reduction, not a restructuring toward a lighter footprint that maintained core capabilities while reducing the financial burden on American taxpayers. Every soldier, every aircraft, every missile defense system, every intelligence sharing arrangement, every joint operational command structure, every element of the American military infrastructure that had been the physical foundation of European security since the end of the Second World War would be dismantled, packed, and shipped home on a timeline of 90 days. Europe had spent the decades since 1945 making a set of defense investment decisions that only made sense within the framework of American military protection. Defense budgets had been structured around the assumption that the most demanding security scenarios would be managed through NATO with American capabilities at their core. The independent European military capacity that would be required to replace what America provided had not been built because the political will to pay for it had never been sustained long enough to produce the capability. What Trump was describing was the removal of the security architecture that Europe depended on from a standing start with a 90-day deadline in a strategic environment that included a heavily armed Russia that had been watching the fracturing of Western unity with interest it had not bothered to conceal. The calculation that every European record, they had been in the room, they had heard what she had heard, and they were doing what she was. The plane landed in Brussels past midnight. Senior officials from across the European institutional architecture were assembled on the tarmac. The faces that greeted von der Leyen as she descended the steps were the faces of people who had been receiving fragmentary information about the meeting's content through back channels during the flight, and who had been using that information to begin the same calculation her team had been running at altitude. The emergency meeting that began at 1 in the morning dissolved the normal.